A bearded man shoved a trembling girl to the ground, his boot splashing mud across her face. "She's nothing but a street rat worth more sold than saved," he spat while the child clutched her ragged toy like a shield. But then a calm, furious voice cut through the storm. Alexander Carter, the billionaire, stepping forward. "Touch her again, and you'll regret it. What would you have done in his place? Tell me your thoughts below." The rain hammered against the glittering coastline of Monaco, blurring the lights of the harbor into trembling streaks of gold and white. Waves crashed against the breakwater with a violence that seemed to echo the storm raging in the skies above. In this city of glamour and wealth, where champagne flowed as freely as the Mediterranean breeze, no one wanted to be out in such weather. But one small figure had no choice. Sophia was only 7, but she had already learned that hunger had its own way of making the world cruel. Barefoot, her thin legs splashed through flooded alleys, her soaked dress clinging to her trembling body. She clutched a ragged toy rabbit against her chest, the last fragment of a life she could barely remember. Lightning split the sky, and for a moment her face appeared wide-eyed and desperate, framed by hair plastered to her cheeks. She didn't know where she was running, only that the men shouting behind her earlier had finally given up. Now she was running from the rain, from fear, from loneliness itself. On the hill above the marina, the Carter estate stood like a fortress of glass and stone overlooking the city with quiet command. The mansion's walls glowed faintly under security lights, and at its gates stood a house larger than most families could ever dream of. For most, it was untouchable, another reminder of how different the lives of the rich were from those below. But to Sophia, it looked like the only place left where she could hide from the storm. She squeezed through a gap in the iron fence, scraping her arms on the cold metal. Her small frame disappeared into the manicured garden's hedges, bending under the weight of rain. She crouched behind a rosebush, her breath fogging in the chilled air. She might have stayed there until dawn, too frightened to move, if not for the sound of an engine humming gently up the drive. A sleek black car, polished even beneath sheets of rain, rolled slowly toward the garage. Inside, Alexander Carter gripped the steering wheel with practiced calm. He was 45 years old, a man whose name commanded the real estate world from London to Hong Kong. People spoke of him as unshakable, brilliant, impossibly disciplined. He lived alone in this palace of steel and marble, accompanied only by staff who came and went like shadows. Success had bought him everything except the one thing he never admitted: he lacked connection. As the car stopped, Alexander slipped out, keys in hand. He adjusted his coat against the rain, already calculating the reports he needed to review before tomorrow's meeting in Geneva. But then a small voice cut through the storm. "Sir, may I sleep in your dog's house tonight?" He froze. For a moment he wondered if the storm was playing tricks on his mind. He turned slowly, scanning the dim driveway until his eyes found her. A tiny figure soaked to the bone stood just a few feet away. Her lips trembled with each word, her eyes both pleading and afraid. "I'll be quiet," she added quickly, as though afraid he would scold her. "Just until the storm passes." Alexander blinked, utterly unprepared. He had spent his life negotiating billion-dollar contracts, yet here he was undone by a child no taller than his waist. He had no dog. He had never even considered one. Pet seemed messy, unpredictable. But the girl didn't know that. To her, even a dog's house was more hope than the rain-soaked streets. He stared at her longer than he meant to, his mind turning over images from his own childhood memories he usually locked away. The thought of a 7-year-old braving the night alone struck him like a blow. For a moment, the storm seemed to vanish, silence stretching between them. "You can't stay out here," he said, finally, his voice firmer than he expected. The girl lowered her gaze to the puddles at her feet. "I won't make a mess." The garden is fine." He felt something twist inside his chest, an ache unfamiliar and unsettling. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sophia," she whispered. He crouched so that his eyes met hers. Up close, he could see the scratches on her arms, the mud caked on her small hands, the way her shoulders shook beneath the soaked fabric of her dress. But what struck him most were her eyes, dark wide, filled with a mixture of fear and a desperate kind of hope that seemed too old for her face. "Sophia," he repeated slowly, testing the sound. "I can't let you sleep outside. Come in, at least until you're warm." Her eyes widened as though she had misheard him. "Inside?" she asked softly, disbelief coloring her tone. "Yes, inside." He opened the heavy door light spilling onto the stone steps. For years those doors had welcomed only business partners and acquaintances. Now they stood open for a child who had asked only for a corner of shelter. She hesitated, glancing at her dripping clothes, then back at him. "I'll get everything dirty." "Furniture can be cleaned," he said, and for the first time in a long while he felt the truth of his words. Slowly, cautiously, Sophia stepped across the threshold. Her small feet left wet prints on the polished marble floor, each step like a declaration that something had changed. She lifted her gaze to the grand chandelier glittering above the marble staircase, curling upward like something out of a storybook. Her mouth parted in wonder, but she said nothing. Alexander watched her, a strange mixture of pride and shame rising inside him. He had spent decades building this palace, collecting art, filling rooms with treasures. Yet it had never looked so different until seen through her eyes. "My name is Alexander," he said, closing the door gently behind them. "You're safe here tonight." Sophia hugged the rabbit closer and nodded, her wet hair clinging to her cheeks. She didn't thank him. Perhaps she didn't trust yet that she wouldn't be asked to leave. But in her silence, Alexander felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He had no idea why this moment mattered so much, but he knew with certainty that his life had just shifted as surely as the tides battering Monaco's coast outside. The storm roared on, but inside the mansion a fragile calm began to bloom, one that neither the child nor the billionaire fully understood. The mansion was a world Sophia had never seen before, a place where warmth poured from golden lights, and every surface gleamed as though it had never known dust. She stood just inside the door, dripping onto the marble floor, unsure whether to take another step. The scent of polished wood and faint cologne hung in the air, so different from the mildew and street smoke that clung to her clothes. Alexander Carter placed his coat on a chair and looked down at her, not with the impatience of a man inconvenienced, but with a kind of cautious curiosity. "Come," he said, his voice steady but softer than before. He led her past paintings that looked as though they belonged in museums, past heavy velvet drapes that muted the storm outside. Sophia trailed behind her fingers, brushing against the wall as though she needed to confirm the house was real. He opened a door to a guest bathroom, and the sight before her made her gasp. Marble tiles stretched from floor to ceiling, reflecting the glow of a chandelier. A bathtub, large enough to be a pool in her eyes, filled slowly with steaming water as Alexander turned the polished faucets. The sound of rushing water was strange to her, not because she hadn't heard it before, but because here it meant safety and comfort. "Warm water," she whispered as though it were a secret. She stood motionless at the threshold, unwilling to step further. Alexander noticed her hesitation. He brought out towels from a nearby cabinet, soft Egyptian cotton, and placed them neatly by the tub. "It's for you," he said simply. Her eyes widened. "For me," he nodded. "You can take a bath. It will help you feel warm again." For a moment, Sophia's lips trembled with the urge to protest. In her world, hot water was a privilege, not something freely offered. She stepped in carefully, her small hand resting on the marble rim as though it might vanish. She touched the rising steam, smiling faintly when it curled around her fingers. Alexander excused himself, leaving the door ajar so she would not feel trapped. In the quiet of his own thoughts, he was surprised by how deeply the image of her wonder touched him. He had designed this house to impress partners to signal wealth, but tonight it served a far simpler purpose: to offer a child her first taste of comfort. When Sophia finally emerged, wrapped in a towel that nearly swallowed her whole, she looked transformed. Her hair fell in damp waves around her face. Her cheeks flushed from the warmth. She clutched the towel tightly, eyes darting nervously as though unsure what would happen next. Alexander handed her one of his plain white shirts, so oversized it reached her knees. She put it on with careful precision, smoothing the fabric as if it were silk. "You must be hungry," he said. She nodded, without speaking, but the faint growl of her stomach answered for her. In the kitchen, Alexander opened a refrigerator lined with delicacies, caviar, imported cheeses, wines worth thousands. None of it seemed right. After a pause, he settled on something far simpler. He heated milk, whisking in chocolate until it frothed, and set out a plate of cookies from the pantry. The smell filled the room, sweet and inviting. Sophia sat at the edge of a tall chair, her legs swinging but not reaching the ground. When the mug was placed in front of her, she hesitated. She held it with both hands, as though it might be taken away at any moment. The first sip made her eyes close, and when she opened them again, tears shimmered at the edges. "It's too good," she murmured, her voice breaking. Alexander watched silently, something in his chest tightening. She ate slowly, nibbling at each cookie, but he noticed her slipping one into her pocket when she thought he wasn't looking. Old habits of survival. He didn't stop her. Instead, he felt a quiet sorrow that a child so young had already learned to hoard food against tomorrow's hunger. When her small body began to sag with exhaustion, she asked timidly, "Can I sleep on the couch? I promise I won't make a mess." Alexander felt the weight of those words. She was asking permission to exist in his space, not demanding, not assuming. "You'll sleep in the guest room," he replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. Her eyes widened in shock, as though he had offered her a palace. He led her up the staircase to a room rarely used. The bed was vast, draped in linen so white they almost glowed. Sophia stood frozen at the doorway, staring at it as if it were a cloud. "It's too big," she whispered. "It's yours tonight," Alexander said. He adjusted the pillows, awkward, in a way that betrayed how long it had been since he had cared for anyone but himself. She climbed onto the bed, disappearing into the folds of the blanket, her rabbit toy tucked under her arm. As he switched off the light, leaving only a small lamp glowing, he heard her voice in the dark. "Thank you, Mr. Alexander." He paused. Gratitude from a child who had nothing struck him deeper than any accolade he had received in his career. He closed the door gently, his footsteps echoing in the silent hallway. That night, Alexander sat in his study, surrounded by contracts and financial reports. But he couldn't concentrate. His thoughts returned again and again to the small figure curled in the guest bed. Something about her presence unsettled the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself. It wasn't pity. It was something heavier, more personal. For the first time in years, he questioned whether his life, his towering success, his endless solitude had ever been enough. Down the hall, Sophia slept more soundly than she had in months. For once, she did not dream of streets or hunger. She dreamed of warmth, of a voice that had not turned her away, of a house that might hold a corner just for her. Invisible wounds cannot be healed in a single night, but the storm outside had given her more than shelter. It had given her a glimpse of belonging, and for Alexander it had cracked open a door he never knew he had locked. The sound of the rain softened, and in its rhythm lay the fragile beginning of a bond neither of them had expected. Morning sunlight spilled through the wide windows of the Carter estate, flooding the marble floors with warmth. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sophia awoke without shivering. She stretched beneath the heavy blanket, blinking at the golden light, disoriented by comfort itself. The night before felt like a dream. The bath, the food, the towering bed that had cradled her tiny body like a cocoon. She hugged her toy rabbit and whispered to it, as if reassuring herself that all of it was real. Downstairs, Alexander was already seated at the long dining table, a newspaper folded beside a steaming cup of coffee. His eyes, however, were not on the print. They kept drifting toward the hallway, waiting for the sound of small footsteps. When Sophia appeared wearing the oversized shirt he had given her, her hair brushed smooth by a timid hand, he felt something stir in him. The house no longer seemed so cavernous, so empty. Breakfast was simple toast eggs, fresh fruit. Sophia ate quietly, her posture alert, as though every bite might be her last. Alexander watched silently, noting the careful way she saved pieces of bread at the side of her plate. Invisible wounds lingered even in the smallest gestures. Later that morning, he decided to take her out. "You need proper clothes," he said, gently but firmly. She blinked at him, uncertain, until he added, "We'll go together. Just a few things." They drove into Milan, the sleek car, gliding along sunlit roads until the city rose around them with its bustle and elegance. Sophia pressed her face to the window, eyes wide at the sight of shop windows and cafes, the cathedral spires reaching into the sky. When Alexander guided her into a clothing store, she hesitated at the threshold, overwhelmed by racks of colors and textures she had never known. She picked the cheapest items she could find, tugging at his sleeve to show him a plain dress, a pair of jeans. Her voice was small. "These are enough, Mr. Alexander. You don't have to spend so much." He studied her for a long moment before placing a hand on her shoulder. "Sophia, you deserve more than enough." It was then, amid the hum of the store, that shadows from her past began to reemerge. As they walked toward the register, Sophia's body stiffened. Her small hand clutched his arm with sudden strength. He followed her gaze to the street outside, where 3 men leaned against a wall, their eyes locked on her. Sophia's breath quickened. Her whisper trembled. "It's them." The men began to move, pushing through the crowd. Alexander reacted without thinking, drawing her closer. He stepped outside, his presence towering, protective. The largest man, bearded and grinning with menace, spoke first. "Looks like you found our little friend. You've been following her." Alexander's voice cut through the air, sharp as glass. "She belongs to us," another sneered, spitting on the ground. "Not about bread. It's about respect. She came into our streets and now she owes us." Alexander felt a fury rise, raw and unfamiliar. "She's a child," he said, his voice steady, though his pulse thundered. "You will not come near her again." The men laughed loud and mocking. Passers-by glanced, but quickly looked away, pretending not to see. In that moment, Alexander understood his wealth and reputation meant nothing here. This was a world ruled by intimidation, where a frightened girl could vanish and no one would interfere. He pulled Sophia behind him, her fingers digging into his sleeve. The men stepped closer, their laughter fading into threats. "We can make her disappear," the bearded one said, his voice low, "unless you'd like to make it worth our while." It was an extortion, thinly veiled, a transaction dressed as menace. Alexander reached for his wallet, not because he thought money would solve it, but because he needed time. He handed over bills with a cold glare. "Take this and never come back." The men accepted, but their smiles only grew sharper. "Money won't change what she is," one of them said. "Street rats always crawl back." Sophia trembled, her eyes brimming with tears, and Alexander felt the weight of her fear settle into his bones. He guided her quickly back into the car, locking the doors with a snap. As the engine roared to life, Sophia buried her face against his sleeve. "They won't stop," she whispered. "They never stop." Back at the mansion, silence clung to them. Alexander poured a glass of water for her, his hand steady though his mind raced. He knew those men would not simply vanish. They would circle back, waiting for weakness. That evening, a new visitor arrived, a social worker from Naples, drawn by reports that a child had been seen entering the Carter estate. Her name was Clara Rossi, a woman with kind eyes and the practiced calm of someone who had seen too many stories like Sophia's. She asked questions where Sophia had come from, what Alexander intended. Sophia clung to the arm of his chair, her voice breaking as she insisted, "He takes care of me. Please don't send me back." Clara listened, her pen still against the paper. She explained the procedures, the need for documentation, the slow machinery of law. Alexander found himself bristling at the thought of bureaucracy deciding the fate of a child whose life had already been marked by indifference. Later, his sister arrived unannounced from London. Evelyn Carter was a woman of politics, poised and unyielding. She entered the mansion like a storm, her voice sharp with accusation. "Alexander, what madness is this, a child from the streets? Do you realize the scandal this could cause?" Her words struck him harder than the threats of the men in Milan. To Evelyn, everything was about reputation, the family name, the empire they had built. She urged him to let social services handle it to protect their legacy. But when Alexander looked at Sophia, her small frame pressed against the back of the couch, eyes wide with fear at the thought of losing her, he knew he had already chosen. The streets had left their shadows on her, but he would not let them take her back. The night grew long, filled with unanswered questions and threats that loomed larger than the storm outside. Yet, as Sophia drifted into uneasy sleep, Alexander sat beside her, his resolve hardening. Wealth alone could not shield her. To keep her safe, he would need something stronger than money. He would need courage he had not called upon in years, and a willingness to fight a battle that went far beyond boardrooms and contracts. The shadows from the streets had found them, and Alexander understood his life would never return to what it had been. Not after Sophia. Not now. The days following the confrontation in Milan were uneasy. Alexander tightened security around the estate, but he could not erase the fear he saw in Sophia's eyes whenever a car slowed on the street outside. She tried to be brave, but the way her small body tensed at sudden noises betrayed her. He reassured her that she was safe, though, in truth, he was haunted by doubt. Shadows do not disappear simply because you close a door. One afternoon, while Alexander was tied up in meetings with his legal advisors about the possibility of guardianship, Sophia accompanied Clara Rossi, the social worker, to a routine medical appointment in the city. Alexander hesitated to let her go without him, but Clara insisted it was necessary, promising to keep her safe. Sophia, eager for a sense of normality, convinced him with a timid smile. "It's only a checkup. I'll be fine." He wasn't. Hours later, when his phone rang with Clara's trembling voice on the other end, his world collapsed. "Alexander, they took her. They took Sophia." The words tore through him. Clara explained between sobs 3 men had cornered them outside the clinic, one pressing a note into her hand, while the others dragged Sophia into a van. "They knew your name," she said. "They said you had 24 hours to pay 50,000 euros, or she would disappear forever." Alexander felt cold fury settle into his bones. Money was never the real demand. It was power control cruelty. Yet he had no choice but to follow. That evening he withdrew the funds, each euro a hollow offering. At midnight, a call came from an unlisted number. The bearded man's voice slithered down the line. "We have her. If you want her alive, bring 100,000 to the docks in Barcelona. Alone." Clara begged him to call the police. But Alexander shook his head. If we involve them, they'll vanish with her. He could not take that risk. For the first time in years, he felt utterly powerless, stripped of the armor his fortune usually provided. Yet beneath that helplessness surged something fiercer determination. He would not let them win. The night was heavy when he reached the abandoned warehouse at the edge of Barcelona's port. Rusting containers loomed like silent sentinels, the sea air sharp with salt and oil. He carried a duffel bag stuffed with cash, his every step echoing against the cracked pavement. Inside, under the flicker of a single bulb, he found her. Sophia sat tied to a chair, her face pale, her cheeks streaked with dried tears. But when her eyes lifted and found his, something sparked. "Mr. Alexander," she whispered, relief flooding her voice. "Let her go," he demanded, his voice steady, though his hands clenched around the strap of the bag. The bearded man stepped from the shadows, flanked by his accomplices. "Do you have it?" Alexander tossed the bag forward. 80,000. The rest comes when she's safe. The men laughed. "Do you think we bargain with lives, Carter? The girl is worth more than money? Pretty clever. She'll fetch a high price elsewhere if you don't meet our demands." The words twisted like a knife. Alexander took a step forward, but before he could speak, Sophia's voice cut through the tension. "You can't sell me," she said, her tone surprisingly calm for a child, "because I know who you are." The men froze. "I heard you talking." She continued, her eyes sharp. "Your name is Mark Riley. You live on Blossom Lane. You have a daughter who goes to St. Francis School." The bearded man paled, rage flickering in his eyes. "And you," she said, turning to the second John Davis. "Your mother's in the hospital in Naples. You don't want her to know what you really do." The room shifted. Their confidence faltered, exposed by the precision of a child's memory. Even Alexander was stunned by her courage. She had taken what little power she had, her eyes, her ears, and turned it into a weapon sharper than any blade. Distant sirens wailed, faint but growing. Clara had disobeyed his instructions, contacting the authorities after all. The men exchanged frantic glances. "This isn't over," Riley snarled, cutting the ropes from Sophia's wrists before bolting for the rear exit. Alexander rushed forward, gathering Sophia into his arms. She clung to him with desperate strength, her small frame shaking. "I knew you would come," she whispered against his chest. He held her close, his throat tight. "No one will ever take you from me again." When the police arrived minutes later, the warehouse was empty of the kidnappers, but full of the echoes they left behind. Sophia, though trembling, stood beside Alexander with her head high. She had faced terror, and fought it with nothing but her mind and her will, and Alexander knew then that she was not just a child in need of saving, she was someone who had saved him too from the emptiness of his own life. That night, as they drove away from Barcelona's port, Sophia fell asleep against his side. Alexander looked out at the city lights, the sea stretching endlessly beyond, and felt a clarity he had never known. This was no longer about protection out of obligation. It was about love, about family, about a bond that neither money nor fear could ever sever. The battle was not only for her safety, it was for the right to stand by her, to be the person she could trust when the world turned dark. And he would fight that battle for the rest of his life if he had to. 6 weeks after the night at the Barcelona docks, the Carter estate no longer felt like a monument to isolation. The silence that once stretched endlessly through its halls had been replaced with the sound of laughter, of hurried footsteps, of questions asked in a child's curious voice. Sophia had changed not only in appearance, but in spirit. Her cheeks carried a healthy glow, her hair caught the light in soft waves, and her once wary eyes now shone with a confidence Alexander had never seen before. She had begun to dream and with each dream Alexander found himself rediscovering life through her. On the morning of the adoption hearing in Paris, Alexander stood before the mirror, adjusting his tie. His hands, usually so steady, trembled with anticipation. Today, he would no longer be a guardian in practice, but in law. Today, Sophia would officially become his daughter. When she ran into the room in her pale blue dress, the same one she had once only dared to admire in the shop window, he felt his throat tighten. "Do I look all right?" she asked, spinning, so the skirt flared around her knees. "You look perfect," he said, kneeling, so his eyes met hers. Absolutely perfect. In the Paris courthouse, the grandeur of the chambers seemed to overwhelm Sophia at first, but when the judge asked her where she wanted to live, she answered with unwavering certainty. "With Mr. Alexander. With my dad." The word hung in the air, fragile, yet powerful. Alexander's eyes blurred as he heard it, and for the first time in decades he let the tears fall. The adoption was finalized within the hour, and when the papers were handed to him they felt heavier than any contract he had ever signed. This was not business. This was belonging. Even Evelyn, his sister, had traveled to Paris. Weeks earlier, she had been furious, warning of scandal, but she had seen the transformation in her brother and the child. Standing outside the courthouse, she bent to embrace Sophia, her carefully composed mask slipping into something warmer. "You're a family now," she whispered, and for the first time, she meant it. Back in Monaco, the mansion had begun to reflect the change in its owner. The sterile perfection softened into a home filled with signs of life. Books scattered on tables, drawings taped to the refrigerator, a soccer ball resting in the corner of the garden. Alexander no longer worked endless hours behind closed doors. He walked Sophia to school, sat with her while she did her homework, and learned the art of listening truly, listening to the stories of her day. She had once asked for nothing more than a corner of shelter, and now she carried the knowledge that she would never again be turned away. But Alexander's vision extended beyond his own home. He could not ignore the truth Sophia had forced him to confront. There were countless other children still wandering the streets, still asking for a safe place that might not come. He founded an organization in her name, Sophia's Haven, a network of shelters across Europe that offered not just beds, but warmth, education, and dignity. The first center opened in Naples, not far from where Sophia had once run from an orphanage that failed her. At the inauguration, she stood proudly beside him, her small hand wrapped around his. When the ribbon was cut, the applause of the crowd faded beneath her voice as she leaned close and whispered, "We're helping them, aren't we?" "Yes," he said, "because you showed me how." Evenings at the estate grew sacred. Sometimes they sat in the garden, watching the sky burn orange over the Mediterranean, Sophia nestled against his side. Sometimes Clara Rossi joined them, her friendship becoming something deeper as she watched the bond between father and daughter grow. Together, they planned new projects, new ways to reach children who needed what Sophia once asked for in trembling words, just a place to stay until the storm passed. One quiet evening, Sophia tugged at Alexander's hand and led him to a small corner of the garden. There, where the rain had once drenched her shivering body, stood a simple wooden structure. It was the doghouse she had first spoken of, rebuilt with fresh wood and painted white. Around it bloomed a circle of flowers she had planted herself. On a small plaque was inscribed, "For every child still searching for a home, and for those who have found one." Alexander knelt beside her, his arm around her shoulders. "You asked me once for a doghouse," he said softly. Sophia nodded, her eyes shining. "But you gave me a home." "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You gave me one. You gave me family." As the sun sank and the first stars pierced the sky, Alexander realized that the storm which had once brought Sophia to his doorstep had not been a curse, but a gift. It had shattered the walls of his solitude and filled his life with the one thing he had never dared hope for: love. From that night on, the Carter estate was no longer the mansion of a solitary billionaire. It was the home of a father and his daughter, a place where laughter echoed louder than silence, and where a simple question asked in desperation had grown into a legacy that would shelter countless others. Sometimes, when the evening grew still, Sophia would ask to hear the story of that first night again, the storm, the question, the open door, and Alexander would tell it not as a tale of pity or rescue, but as the moment everything truly began. Because sometimes love does not arrive in grand gestures or perfect plans. Sometimes it begins with a child standing in the rain, whispering the most extraordinary words, "Can I stay?" From the very first night when Sophia appeared drenched and trembling on Alexander Carter's doorstep, to the day she proudly wore her blue dress in a Paris courtroom, this story has carried us through storms, fears, and triumphs. What began with a desperate plea, asking to sleep in a doghouse, became a journey that redefined the meaning of home, family, and courage. Sophia's transformation from a child surviving on scraps to a daughter cherished beyond measure was not a miracle of wealth, but of love. Alexander, once a man surrounded by marble walls and silence, discovered that the true measure of his life was not in contracts or fortunes, but in the smile of a little girl who finally knew what it meant to belong. He fought men who threatened her, faced the doubts of his own sister, endured the pain of her kidnapping, and still chose her every time. In return, Sophia revealed a strength far greater than her years, using her wits and bravery to outsmart her captors, standing tall even when fear should have broken her. Together, they built more than a family. They created a legacy. Sophia's haven became a symbol of hope, a promise to countless children who still wandered the streets in search of safety. It showed that even in a world where cruelty exists, compassion can rise stronger, spreading ripples that reach far beyond one household. Their bond became a living testimony that sometimes the most powerful changes begin with a simple act of kindness and a willingness to open a door. And what can we learn from this? That love and responsibility are choices we make every day. That wealth is not defined by numbers in a bank, but by the lives we touch. That even when storms rage around us, we have the power to be someone's shelter. Perhaps we may not all build shelters or foundations, but we can all pause long enough to see the vulnerable among us, to listen, to care, to choose compassion, when indifference would be easier. Sophia and Alexander remind us that family is not just blood, but the people who choose each other against all odds. They remind us that courage does not always look like grand gestures. It can be the quiet decision to stay, to protect, to love when it is difficult. And they remind us that sometimes what we think is a burden is in truth the greatest gift we could ever receive. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear what part resonated with you most. Share your thoughts, because your voice matters here. And if you want to keep hearing stories that inspire, uplift, and remind us of our shared humanity, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support gives us the strength to keep creating powerful stories like this one. And together we can spread messages of love and hope even further.